In dreams, Grievous remembered his life, his mortal life. On Kalee, and in the aftermath of the Huk War, the ones he had loved, the ones he had lost. Because of the remoteness of their home world, his species, the Kaleesh, had had few dealings with the Jedi. But then war had broken out between the Kaleesh and their planetary neighbours, a savage insectile species known as the Huk. Grievous had become infamous during the long conflict, conquering worlds, defeating grand armies, exterminating entire colonies of Huk. But instead of surrendering, as would have been the honourable course, the Huk had appealed to the Republic to intercede, and the Jedi had arrived on Kalee. In what passed for negotiations, 50 Jedi Knights and Masters, ready to loose their lightsabers on Grievous and his army, the Kaleesh were made to appear the aggressors. The reason was plain. Where Kalee had little to offer in the way of trade, the Huk worlds were rich in ore and other resources lusted after by the Trade Federation and others. Chastised by the Republic, the Kaleesh foundered. Sanctions and reparations were imposed. Traders avoided the planet. Grievous's people starved and perished by the hundreds of thousands. Ultimately, the intergalactic banking clan had come to their rescue, helping with funds, reinstating trade, providing Grievous with a new direction. Years later, the Munes would come again. In dreams, Grievous remembered his life, his mortal life. On Kalee, and in the aftermath of the Huk War, after all the close calls on battlefields, on his home system worlds, on Huk worlds, sowing destruction, exterminating as many of them as he could. After all the times he had returned home wounded, bloodied to the bone, surrounded by his wives and offspring, basking in their support, relying on it to recall him to life. After all the brushes with death, to be fatally injured in a shuttle crash. The unfairness, the indignity had caused him more pain than the injuries themselves. To be denied a warrior's death, as was his due, floating suspended in Bacta, keenly aware that no healing fluid or gamma blade wielded by living being or droid could ever repair his body. In moments of consciousness, seeing his wives and his offspring, gazing on his ravaged body from the far side of the permaglass, offering words of encouragement, prayers for his return to health. He had asked himself, could he be content to be a mind in a body without feeling? More, could he abandon a life of combat for a life in which the only battles he fought were with himself? The struggle to endure, to live another day? No, it was beyond him. By then the Huk War had ended, more accurately had been ended by the Jedi, and the Kaleesh were still reaping the whirlwind, their world in ruins, their appeals for justice and fair play ignored by the Republic. Ever on the alert for investment opportunities, members of the intergalactic banking clan had offered Kalee a dubious sort of rescue. They would support the planet financially, assume its staggering debt, if Grievous would agree to serve the clan as an enforcer. Their hailfire weapons were proficient at delivering payment reminders to delinquent clients, and their IG-series assassin droids took care of the wet work. But the hailfires had to be programmed, the IGs were dangerously unpredictable, and assassination was bad for business. The clan wanted someone with a talent for intimidation, both to save his world and to provide himself with a touch of the life he had known as a warrior, a strategist, a leader of armies. Grievous had accepted the offer. IBC Chairman San Hill himself had overseen the details of the arrangement. Still, Grievous wasn't entirely proud of his decision. Debt collection was a far cry from Warcraft, an arena for beings without principles, for beings so attached to their possessions that they feared death. But Kalee had profited from his work for the intergalactic banking clan. and Grievous's previous notoriety was such that it could not be eclipsed. Then, the shuttle crash, the accident, the misfortune. He told his would-be healers to fish him from the Bacta tank. He could bear to die in atmosphere or the vacuum of deep space, but not in liquid. In the shadow of felled trees that would fuel his funeral pyre, he lapsed in and out of consciousness. That was when San Hill himself had paid Grievous a second visit, something consequential in mind, obvious even to someone who could barely see straight. "We can keep you alive," Hill had whispered into Grievous's unimpaired ear. Others had promised as much. He pictured breathing devices, a hover platform, a surround of life-sustaining machines. But Hill had said, none of that. You will walk, you will speak, you will retain your memories, your mind. "I have my mind," Grievous said. "What I lack is a body. Most of your internal organs are damaged beyond the repair of the finest surgeons," Hill had continued. "And you will have to surrender even more than you already have. You will no longer know the pleasures of the flesh. Flesh is weak. You need only gaze on me to see that." Encouraged by the remark, Hill had talked in glowing terms of the Geonosians, how they had raised cyborg technology to an art form, and how the blending of living and machine technology was the future. "Consider the battle droids of the Trade Federation," Hill had said. "They answer to a brain that is also nothing more than a droid. Protocol droids, astromechs, even assassin droids, all require programming and frequent maintenance." Two words had caught Grievous's attention. Battle droids. "A war is brewing that will call many droids to the front," Hill had said just loudly enough to be heard. "I am not privy to when it will begin, but when that day comes, the entire galaxy will be involved." His interest piqued, Grievous had said. A war begun by whom? The banking clan? The Trade Federation? Someone more powerful? Who? "In time, you will meet him, and you will be impressed." Then why does he need me? "In every war there are leaders and there are commanders." A commander of droids. More precisely, a living commander of droids. So he had allowed the Geonosians to go to work on him, constructing a duranium and ceramic shell for what little of him remained. His recuperation had been long and difficult, coming to terms with his new and in many ways improved self, even longer and more difficult. Only then had he been presented to Count Dooku, and only then had his real training begun. From the Geonosians and members of the Techno-Union, he had already come to understand the inner workings of droids. But from Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, he came to understand the inner workings of the Sith. Tyrannus himself had trained him in lightsaber technique. In mere weeks he had surpassed any of Tyrannus's previous students. It helped, of course, to have an indestructible body reminiscent of a Krath war droid. The ability to tower over most sentient beings, crystal circuitry, 6 grasping appendages. In dreams he remembered his past life. But in fact he was not dreaming, for dreams were a product of sleep, and General Grievous did not sleep. He endured instead brief periods of stasis in a pod-like chamber that had been created for him by his body's builders. While inside that chamber he could sometimes recall what it had felt like to live. And while inside he was not to be disturbed unless in the event of inimical circumstances. The chamber was equipped with displays linked to devices that monitored the status of the invisible hand. But Grievous was aware of a problem even before the displays told him as much. As he exited the chamber and hurried for the cruiser's bridge, a droid joined him, supplying updates. From their first acquaintance, Viceroy Gunray had made the mistake of treating Grievous as just another droid, even though he had been told that this was not the case. Perhaps Gunray had thought of him as some mindless entity, like the reawakened Jedi, Dirge, or Dooku's misguided apprentice, Asajj Ventress, or the humanoid bounty hunter called Aurra Sing, all 3 of whom had been so driven by personal hatred of the Jedi that they had proved worthless. mere distractions while Grievous went about the real business of war. The attitude of the Separatist leaders had changed quickly enough, though in part because they had been witness to Grievous's capabilities, but more as a result of what had occurred on Geonosis at the start of the Clone Wars. Had it not been for Grievous, Gunray and the rest might have suffered the same fate as the Lieutenant Sun Fac. Grievous's actions in the catacombs that day, with the Geonosians retreating by the thousands from the arena and companies of clone commandos following them in, had allowed Gunray and the others to escape the planet alive. Sometimes he wondered just how many clones he had killed or wounded that day. And Jedi, of course, though none had lived to speak of him. The Jedi corpses that were retrieved bespoke something atrocious that resided in those dark underground passages. Perhaps the Jedi believed that a rancor or a reek had shredded the bodies of their forceful comrades. Or perhaps they thought the damage had been done by Geonosian sonic weapons set to maximum power. Either way, they must have wondered what became of the victims' lightsabers. Grievous regretted that he hadn't been able to see the reactions, but he too had been forced to flee as Geonosis fell. The revelation of his existence had had to wait until a handful of hapless Jedi had arrived on the foundry world of Hypori. By then, Grievous had already amassed a sizable collection of lightsabers, but at Hypori he had been able to add several more, 2 of which he wore inside his command cloak even now. As trophies, they were superior to the pelts of hunted beings he knew some bounty hunters to effect. He admired the precision and care that had gone into the construction of the lightsabers. More, each seemed to retain a faint memory of its wielder. As a former swordmaster, he could appreciate that each had been handcrafted, rather than turned out in quantity like blasters or pike weapons. He could respect the Jedi for that, though he had nothing but hatred for them. As an order. The general was not accustomed to losing in battle. Even when a general among his own species, he had suffered few defeats. That was originally what had brought him to the attention of Darth Sidious. After the Sith Lord had expressed interest in Grievous to Dooku, Dooku in turn had expressed interest in Grievous to Chairman San Hill of the Intergalactic Banking Clan. Poor Grievous, Dooku thought. Pitiful creature. During the Huk War, and later while in the employ of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, Grievous had survived numerous attempts on his life, so an assassination attempt was ruled out almost immediately. Hill himself had come up with the idea of a shuttle crash, though that too presented risks. What if Grievous should actually die in the crash? Then the Separatists would simply have to look elsewhere for a commander, Dooku had told Hill. But Grievous had survived, and only too well. In fact, most of the life-threatening injuries he sustained had occurred after he had been pulled from the flaming shuttle wreck, and with great calculation. When at last he had agreed to be rebuilt, promises were made that no critical alterations would be made to his mind. But the Geonosians had ways of modifying the mind without a patient ever being aware that they had been tampered with. Grievous certainly believed that he had always been the cold-blooded conqueror he was now, when in truth his cruelty and prowess owed much to his rebuilding. Sidious and Dooku couldn't have been more pleased with the result, Dooku especially since he had no interest in commanding an army of droids, and already had his hands full nursemaiding the Separatist leaders and others who would form the Council of Separatists. Grievous had been a delight to train as well, no need to coax him to release his anger and rage, as Dooku had been forced to do during the training of his so-called Dark Jedi disciples. The Geonosians had arranged for Grievous to be nothing but anger and rage, and as to the general's combat skills, few, if any, Jedi would be capable of defeating him. There had been moments during the extensive combat sessions when even Dooku had been hard-pressed to outduel the cyborg, but then Dooku had kept some secrets to himself, just in case. Manipulation of the sort that had gone into the transformation of Grievous went to the heart of what it meant to be a Sith.